Good morning, everyone. My name is Russell Holden. I'm with Render Plus Software. We are the creators of several extensions for SketchUp. The one that we'll be focusing on this morning is IRender Next. And what I'd like to point out is that if you are using IRender Next, Aerial Vision, or 3D Design Studio, all three of these are extensions for SketchUp. The topics that we'll be discussing this morning, you'll find work exactly the same way, regardless of the plugin that you have installed. So, although I'm using IRender Next specifically as my example this morning, these concepts that we're going to be discussing work exactly the same with Aerial Vision, IRender Next, and 3D Design Studio. I do want to point out that we have some very interesting resources in addition to our webinars. One of them, and probably one of the most useful, is the Render Plus Systems channel on YouTube. If you've not visited our YouTube channel, I want to encourage you to do so. Our YouTube channel includes a number of tutorials created by us at Render Plus Software and several created by end users of IRender Next, Aerial Vision, and 3D Design Studio, a very nice resource for learning some of the advanced features in our software. A website that you might want to bookmark that also includes lots of valuable information, a very important resource for learning more about Render Plus software and our offerings, is renderplus.com. So visit renderplus.com. Many of you may know that I update our webinar schedule frequently. The complete schedule for the month of September is now published, so there may be other topics that you would find interesting. Please visit renderplus.com, look for our webinar schedule. You'll also find comprehensive documentation on our software that can be very helpful. So these are two really important resources. Visit them frequently. Sometimes when you start SketchUp, the toolbar for our software might not load automatically. If that's your experience, just click Extensions and then select the appropriate product. Today, as I mentioned, we'll be using IRender Next. And when the software loads, it will typically install adjacent to the SketchUp toolbar. You can, as you probably well know, peel that away as I've done here, move it anywhere on the screen that you want. Depending on the resolution of your screen, that can be pretty helpful. I also want to point out that at Render Plus Software, we actually offer several free plugins for SketchUp. And one of them that is quite interesting, I want to encourage you to download and install this, is the NXT Library of Materials. When you download and install this library, you're going to find that there are hundreds of predefined materials, and in addition, there are definitions for reflective values set for each of these materials. So for example, it's possible to use this material displayed as a highly polished, shiny material or a relatively flat material. A pretty efficient way to add or update materials in your SketchUp models. Now I have a pretty simple model that we're going to use today. This is a small interior and lots of interesting components that when we render the model without any reflective value set, it's not a bad rendering. The lighting solution is actually very well done, but what this model lacks in terms of realism is the addition of reflections. So again, that's our focus today. I want to begin by showing you the finished rendering after reflections have been set. You'll notice, for example, that there's no reflection on the pictures, there's no reflection on the table, there's no reflection on the brass lamp over here, nothing on the floor. So an interesting model, however, significantly more interesting when reflections are added. So I'd like to show you how this is accomplished with IRender Next, and along the way explain some very important ideas about reflections with a ray trace rendering program. To show you basic concepts, I'm going to use this desk lamp. And when I install this desk lamp from the 3D warehouse, this is exactly how it will render if I do nothing. And so what we have is a very nice desk lamp that is right now restricted to reflecting only light as it hits the surface and bounces back to the eye. By definition, that's a matte finish. And what that means is that the intensity of the reflection, which means how bright is the reflection off of this surface, is set to 0. And you'll notice in this reflection and highlight area of the menu that when intensity is 0, the rest of this area is completely disabled. Now, with IRender Next, we have a concept that we use very consistently in our software called presets. One of the presets for material is a plastic render of the material. When we click plastic, intensity and sharpness values are established automatically by IRender Next. So, for example, plastic is defined as an intensity of 0.25, not very reflective, and a sharpness of 0.2. Sharpness refers to the smoothness of the surface. And so a low value of 0.2 means not very smooth. But when plastic is set, although we can adjust these values, what we will find most times is that selecting a preset value and then rendering will give us exactly the finish on the material that we expect. In fact, this lamp does look like it's made out of plastic. We can do a little bit better than that. For example, when we select the preset value of metal, look what happens to our lamp. No other changes were made to this lamp at all except selecting metal. And when we do, now the lamp looks like a much nicer brass lamp. When metal is selected, there are, in addition to setting the intensity value quite high and the sharpness also at 1, which is the highest value for sharpness, we get a very in-focus reflection in our lamp. Metallic is a very interesting attribute to set for a material. Metal means that reflections off of the metal will be shaded in the color of the metal. When metal is not checked, the reflections off of, in this case, the lamp, will be rendered in the color of the components being reflected. I have another way to illustrate that I think might even make it clearer. Notice next to metallic, there's an option called glossy. Now what glossy does is it removes everything except highlighting from the light sources. So the reflection values have not changed. However, the intensity of the reflection is suppressed and only the lighting is reflected off of the surface. Because metallic is checked, the reflection of that lighting is rendered in the color of the surface. In this case, the brass color of the lamp. I want you to notice what happens when I uncheck metal. So now we have just a glossy surface. And when only glossy is checked, the lighting is reflected in the color of the light. Now, all of the light fixtures that I've added to this model are straight white lights, and so we're getting nice white reflections off of those lights. Again, when I check metallic, notice how yellow the lighting becomes because metal means the light reflected back is reflected in the color of the surface. Unchecked, now we're reflecting light back in the color of the light. This is very helpful when you're generating renderings and you want to be very specific about the type of material for the surface. I went back to the metallic, unchecked glossy, and here I am again with my brass lamp. This is a display of the default values as they are set when you select the preset reflection metal. You can adjust these values. For example, I increased the intensity to 0.98, which intensifies the reflection in the lamp. Now, when I did this, here's what I realized. I realized that this lamp is, in the view that I want to render, is actually going to be seen from across the room. And since the detail of this reflection is so fine, it wouldn't be quite as obvious that this was a brass lamp. And so what I did was I lowered the sharpness value. Lowering the value of the sharpness makes the reflection more fuzzy. Watch what happens. So this is a sharpness value of 0.6, an intensity value of 0.98, so a very intense reflection, and a sharpness value of 0.6. Now, the reason that I wanted to do that is because you'll notice when the reflection is fuzzy, the reflection of the overhead canned lights expands on the surface of this lamp. That will make it much more obvious from across the room that this is a nice brass lamp. Now, technically, when you lower the sharpness value, it means that the material will render as less smooth, or if you want to think about it, as less polished. That makes the reflection more fuzzy. Here are the two side by side. Maybe this points out that you can tell from the lamp on the left that if I'm all the way across the room, 15 feet away, it's going to be very hard to actually see the detail in those reflections. By lowering the sharpness value, and so making the reflection, making the surface less smooth, and so diffusing the reflection, making it more fuzzy, I'm going to be able to see the reflections of those overhead lights much better from across the room. That's a decision for rendering quality, not necessarily being a purist about the material that this lamp is made from. These things are accomplished, by the way, by right-clicking on a material and then using the Edit Material dialog. And on that dialog, in addition to reflections, when I was working on this project, I kind of noticed that I think that brick wall it's really nice and nicely rendered, but looks a little bit flat. And so we have a nice technique that will allow us to give that brick wall a little bit of relief and make it look more three-dimensional. We have traditionally referred to this as texture mapping or bump mapping. All I did to improve the rendering of that brick wall was I used an auto bump texture. And when I do, I get better relief. This will be even more obvious in a rendering that I'm going to show you in just a couple of minutes. Sorry for the aside, but that's an important concept in terms of enhancing the 3D realism of your models, even when you have very good images for materials, sometimes they need a little bit of help. And I decided this brick wall needed some help. This chair is loaded from the 3D warehouse, and without doing anything, it actually renders very nicely. It's a wood chair with a nice red fabric seat. However, it doesn't look as polished as I'd like for it to look. And so the remedy, right-click on the wood. That'll give you access to the Edit Material dialog. And what I selected was a very bright intensity so that I would get bright reflections. Again, remember, I'm going to be looking at this from a pretty good distance across the room. But I didn't want mirror-like reflections, so I lowered the sharpness to 0.4. Pretty low, going to give me a very fuzzy reflection on this chair, but highlights the chair very nicely. So I'm getting very good highlighting from the natural lighting and artificial lighting in the room. Sometimes it's important when we're looking at objects from the 3D warehouse that we don't overlook the obvious. Imagine, for example, that these pictures actually had glass in front of them. The most obvious thing to do is add a surface just in front of those pictures, define it as glass, and then render, and you're done. So that's all I did. When I loaded these pictures from the 3D warehouse, I hung them on the wall, I rendered them. They're actually quite nice. However, what they were lacking for the purposes of my rendering was glass in front of the picture. I added a surface, defined it as glass, and rendered. When you master rendering glass and you're able to make glass look realistic, you are an expert at reflections with IRender Next. I want to show you a couple of examples of that. First of all, there's this glass table. The glass is actually a 1/2 inch thick, which presents a very interesting opportunity when we assign a material. You'll notice in the upper right corner of this dialog that there is both thin and thick glass. Because this, I guess first of all it's important to realize that in the real world, no glass is 0 millimeters thin. Glass is thick. The benefit of choosing thick glass is that when we do, we have the ability to establish the refraction value for the glass. You're going to see what that means in just a few minutes. So thick glass is checked. There's another option that's very nice and makes the rendering more realistic. That's setting caustic to on. Caustic means that as light travels through the glass, some of it will bounce around in the glass and not make it all the way through. And the result then is we're going to get a shadow through this glass onto the floor. Refraction is very important for thick glass. If you just look at the edge of that area rug, I want you to watch what happens when, prior to setting this material as glass, it looked like this. When the material is set as thick glass and the caustic value is set relatively high, watch the edge of that rug through the glass shift. So IRender Next is not only giving us nice reflections, which we would expect off of a glass tabletop, but it's also mimicking the behavior of thick glass as light passes through. Now, learning to render glass and managing glass is absolutely a skill that you'll want to practice with. If you took a component from the 3D warehouse, like this vase with flowers in it, for example, and experimented for a little while with rendering options, treating it as glass, you'll learn a lot about how IRender Next treats materials. Now, for example, I just selected glass. And then when I selected glass, I did a couple of things. And the first thing that I did was I increased the intensity of the reflection. Glass by default is 0.5. And you'll notice that I also selected metallic. I turned metallic on. Now, if you will remember, metallic means that anything reflecting off of this vase is going to be rendered with a strong influence in the reflected components based on the color of the vase, which in this case is an ivory color. So selecting metallic is going to be very interesting. Additionally, by default, when we select glass, glass is defined as 100% transparent. I lower the transparency value to 0.1. So now I started by setting this vase as glass. It would automatically be set to a reflection intensity of 50%, 0.5. It would be set to a transparency value of 100%, which is 1, and metal would not be checked. Most of the time, when you select one of our preset values for a material, it's going to be perfect. Sometimes, however, you can manipulate those values to get a much more interesting rendering of the object. I can kind of see through this vase. It has kind of that opalescent kind of look. It's doing a very nice job of reflecting the objects on the table, the magazines, and it is retaining its color of ivory. Play around a lot with rendering glass, and as you do, first of all, I believe that it'll reinforce some of the things that you learned today, and you're going to find that you can take any surface in any SketchUp model and have complete control over how it renders, and by the way, with very little effort. I have a question by Richard. What is your light setup in this room? Richard, I have rendered this with a background that you can kind of see through the window here. I am rendering with the SketchUp Sun. There is a glass surface, by the way, in this window. That'll be more obvious in a few minutes. And then I have recessed can lighting. I have lighting, the light turned on for the desk lamp. And then I also have two sconces over those pictures. So the total lights in this room is 6 overhead recessed cans, 2 sconces, 1 desk lamp, and then of course the sun. And I hope I'm answering the question that you were asking. And Richard says yes. Lastly, the column. The column in the original rendering looks as though it were painted with kind of a matte red paint. I wanted to change that and make it a little bit shinier so that it'll be rendered now as though it's a semi-gloss paint. It's not always necessary to start with one of our presets. When you feel comfortable with intensity, 0 means no reflection, 1 means the most intense possible reflection, and then all of these values in between. And by the way, you're not just restricted to round values. We could set intensity to 0.63. I mean, you can actually get that specific if you want to. And in some cases, there would be a discernible difference in the quality of the rendering. Then additionally, I've set the sharpness down to 0.45, which, as most of you know, is because I've selected glossy and metallic is not selected. That means the light sources are going to be reflected, and they're going to be relatively fuzzy, and they are going to render in the color of the light source. You'll see that much better in just a few minutes. I'm going to back up because I actually skipped something very important, the wood floor. On the wood floor, I also did not select a preset value. So I didn't select glass or metal or plastic or any of that. But what I was after on this wood floor was I wanted the wood floor to look as though it were finished with a satin finish. That's what I was after. And so remember these values, 0.6 for intensity. So, actually fairly intense, but a sharpness value of 0.4, meaning a pretty fuzzy reflection. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. So you can see, if you just look at the floor here for a minute, you can see that it really does give us the appearance of, a clean floor, a polished floor, but a nice satin finish, which on the lighter wood, that's my preference. It's also possible, of course, to set the reflection and the sharpness really high and get more of a bowling alley finish on this floor. The point being, you have complete control over how a material is going to render and how the reflection values can be used to make it look more realistic and even mimic the finish that you intend for the surface. On the left-hand side, I want you to pay particular attention to the column. On the left, this is more of a matte style finish on the column. On the right, it's more of the semi-gloss style paint. Glossy was selected, metallic was unchecked. So you can tell that the light coming through these sconces, although the bulbs are white, the transparent shades are gold. And so we get nice gold highlights on this column. And then, of course, white highlights from the other artificial lighting in the room. That's a pretty nice example of using glossy as the render parameter for reflections. I wanted to point out one other thing. It's really important, in order to make your renderings as realistic as possible, it's really important when you install into your model components from the 3D warehouse that you render them once or twice and make sure that they look realistic. And a great example is this Eames chair. On the left is prior to adjusting any of the reflection values. And what it looked like to me was that this chair was upholstered with fabric. I don't exactly remember if that's an option with this chair, but I don't think so. I believe that when you order these chairs from Knoll Furniture, you're going to get them upholstered with a really nice leather. And so that leather, of course, would have some reflective properties. I hope that you'll agree with me that the rendering on the right looks like leather, the rendering on the left looks like fabric. And so when you use components from the 3D warehouse, these are, of course, wonderful models that are created and added to the warehouse, but don't assume that the materials are set up to render properly, because, of course, a modeler in SketchUp is not necessarily using a high-end renderer, and so they have no concern over setting things like reflection for the surfaces. Prior to setting reflections for this model, and then after the reflections are set. For those of you who are interested, you'll also notice, by the way, if you look at the glass window, it's actually a little bit darker outside than it is inside, and so I'm picking up some interior reflections in this window. It's kind of a cloudy day outside, so a little bit darker outside than in. There is still nice sun streaming in through the window, breaking through the clouds somewhere. What I want you to pay particular attention to is, first of all, the wall. Because we added that auto bump texture, it does look, in fact, much more textured and more 3D, especially from this view. And then the other important feature is really this floor, which, remember, I wanted to render as kind of a satin finish on the floor. Now, this rendering is a medium resolution rendering, so not high resolution. High resolution renderings take much longer to render than low resolution renderings. Keep in mind when you're setting the resolution that if you start with a 2000 by 1000 resolution rendering, if you double that, you're actually rendering 4 times the number of pixels. So keep that in mind. That's going to have a very big effect on processing time. What you may find more valuable is to increase the number of passes. This rendering, for example, was completed with 1000 passes. For most of the components in this rendering, 1000 passes is not particularly necessary. The lighting is solved well before 1000 passes. However, the reason that I wanted to run so many passes was mostly because of the floor. Let me show you why. Here's this rendering after 5 passes. And what you'll notice is that after 5 passes, you know what? The lighting is actually not bad already. It's obviously got a ways to go. 5 passes wasn't quite enough, but it's doing a pretty nice job of solving the lighting. However, look at the floor. I have pretty sharp reflections in this floor and multiple reflections of these components. I can see 4 lamp reflections in this floor. This will give you a good idea of how fuzzy reflections are actually tackled in the renderer. After 10 passes, another reflection of the lamp actually snuck in, and things are starting to get a little bit more blurred. By 20 passes, you know, this is actually in many respects a pretty acceptable rendering. The light could be solved a little bit better, and my reflections are not quite as fuzzy as I'd like them. Let's go 50 passes. Look how things are really starting to soften up on that floor. At 100 passes, now, you know what, I'm at a rendering that if I was pressed for time, I really would be perfectly ready to save this rendering and take it to a client. I had a little bit more time, so I let this run for 1,000 passes. 1,000 passes took a little bit more than 12 hours. However, absolutely worth it because now I have exactly the floor finish that I'm after for this rendering. I think it was important in this rendering for me because when you consider this rendering overall, the floor actually occupies quite a bit of the rendering. And so to make that floor finish as realistically as possible, especially considering the satin finish that I wanted on the floor, I was quite happy that I had time to let this run for 1,000 passes. Can I run over bump mapping again at the end? I am happy to do that. So let me back up. Bear with me 1 second and I'll back up to the bump textures. Here we are. Bumps or texture mapping can be used in a variety of really interesting ways. The idea is to take a surface from SketchUp, which is typically perfectly flat. And a surface also has a depth of 0 millimeters. So there's no depth whatsoever. And what we want to do is we want to use a texture to render the impression of depth on that surface. Now, auto bump, here's what it does. It actually manipulates the contrast on the surface. And so things that are gray, black or dark gray are going to be exaggerated to darker gray and thicker black. And when you do that, the result, especially if we move ahead to a better angle, is a much more realistic 3D impression of the texture. It's probably very well illustrated here. I mean, even the light, if you look at the upper left-hand corner of the screen, even the light appears to be not washing over a flat surface because of that texture map. If you will visit Render Plus Systems YouTube channel, I recently added a couple of videos that illustrate the use of textures in another interesting way, and that was to take a flat surface and make it appear as though it were water. The only tool that you really need to master in order to make that happen is apply a texture map to what is otherwise a transparent, flat surface. And in that short little, it's a 1-minute video, you'll see the result of using the marble texture and then also using the rubble texture. The rubble texture will give the appearance of a little choppy surface on the water, and the marble texture will give the appearance of some very smooth waves. So anytime you have a surface in your SketchUp model that you don't want to appear as perfectly flat, Richard says, I don't see the auto bump option, just sand, paper, rubble, wrinkled marble pyramid. You need probably to actually, wow, you don't see auto. There's a reason for that, and I have to even remember what it is, Richard. Bear with me for just 1 minute. Do you, oh my goodness, I can't believe I don't remember. Richard, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to look up your email. I'm going to send you an answer to this question because I don't quite remember what the criteria is for auto showing up. But now that you say that, I do remember that sometimes it doesn't. So you know what? If you'll allow me, Richard, I'm going to refresh my memory and I'll send you a quick email to explain it. You know, everyone, that's all the time we have this morning. If you will visit renderplus.com, take a look at our webinar schedule, and you'll find that there are some other interesting webinars running throughout September. I hope you'll find topics that interest you. Register early. These webinars fill up rather quickly, and we do limit the seating to the first 100. I appreciate your being here today. I will publish the recording of this video onto our YouTube channel, give you an opportunity to grab other people in your office and share with them some of these advanced features of IRender Next. I appreciate your being here this morning, and I hope to see you again very soon in another IRender webinar. Thanks, everybody.